Assalamu alaikum everyone, and today I'm going to discuss with you the topic of atheism. 5 main points I'm going to discuss with you in this video. The first is what is atheism, meaning what is the definition of atheism, the old one, how it was understood previously, and now the popularized definition of atheism. The second thing is we're going to discuss why this definition is important. Why does it matter in discussions with atheists? The third thing that we're going to discuss is the issue of what's called universal negatives and the burden of proof. The fourth thing that I'm going to discuss with you is a commonly held epistemology, which means the theory of knowledge, how we know things, how we come to know things, and what knowledge actually is. I'm going to discuss what a popular atheistic epistemology typically consists of and what the flaw or problem with that is. Finally, the fifth thing that I'm going to discuss, which is a common thread amongst popular atheists, especially online, is this idea that there is no evidence for God or the creator of the universe. I'm going to be presenting a short version of some of the evidence that is available to us to show that the claim that there is no evidence is simply false. Now, the first thing that I'm going to discuss is the definition of atheism. Now, pardon me as I read here a quote from a popular atheist website called AmericanAtheist.org. Here's what they have to say, and I quote, "Atheism is one thing, a lack of belief in gods. Atheism is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any question about what a person believes. It is simply a rejection of the assertion that there are gods. Atheism is too often defined incorrectly as a belief system. To be clear, atheism is not a disbelief in gods or a denial of gods. It is a lack of belief in gods." Now they say older dictionaries define atheism as a belief that there is no God. Clearly, theistic influence taints these definitions. The fact that dictionaries define atheism as, quote, "there is no God," betrays a monotheistic influence. Without the monotheistic influence, the definition would at least read, "there are no gods." Now, the problem with this definition is, even by their own admission, it is not an affirmative belief that there is no God, nor does it answer any question about what a person actually believes about the God question, whether there is a God or not. So the problem is that it's too vague, and it's used as sort of an umbrella term in which different atheistic positions can fall under this. This mainly divides into 3 groups. Atheism proper, which was in the old days commonly understood as the proposition that there is no God. Secondly, agnosticism, which means without knowledge. So the agnostic doesn't know if there is a God or not. And thirdly, this verificationism, which comes from the verification principle of knowledge, which was popular in the early 1900s, in which it says any metaphysical claim is just simply meaningless. Now I have on my whiteboard here a diagram to show this. Okay? It says atheism, or what they call atheism, is a lack of belief in a god or gods. Now, this is the umbrella term that they're admitting is vague and doesn't clearly define the position. So then it branches off into 3 categories. Atheism proper, which says there is no God. Agnosticism, which says don't know if there is a God or not. Or this sort of verificationism, which says metaphysical claims are meaningless in general. Okay? Now, let's look from an unbiased source, or what attempts to be an unbiased source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Okay? It says, atheism is typically defined in terms of theism. Theism, in turn, is best understood as a proposition, something that is either true or false, namely, God exists. He does exist or he doesn't exist. It is often defined as the belief that God exists, but here belief means something believed. It refers to the propositional content of belief, not the attitude or mere psychological state of believing. This is why it makes sense to say that theism is true or false, and to argue for or against theism. If, however, atheism is defined in terms of theism, and theism is the proposition that God exists, and not the mere psychological condition of believing that there is a God, then it follows that atheism is not the absence of the psychological condition of believing that God exists. So the key point here is that atheism, if it is a rejection of theism, and theism is defined by propositional content, which means the proposition that God exists, then atheism, if it is the opposite of that, must be understood in terms of its propositional content of the rejection of theism, which would be, there is no God. Okay? So now this business about it being the psychological condition of the person is completely false, and it crumbles upon analysis. Okay? Now, discussing this idea, where did this new popularized definition of atheism come from? I quote, departing even more radically from the norm in philosophy, a few philosophers and quite a few non-philosophers claim that atheism shouldn't be defined as a proposition at all, even if theism is a proposition. Instead, atheism should be defined as a psychological state, the state of not believing in the existence of God or gods. This view was famously proposed by the philosopher Antony Flew, and arguably played a role in his 1972 defense of an alleged presumption of atheism. The editors of the Oxford Handbook of Atheism also favor this definition, and one of them, Stephen Bullivant, defends it on grounds of scholarly utility. His argument is that this definition can best serve as an umbrella term for a wide variety of positions that have been identified with atheism, which is what I have showed on my board. Their new definition has become so vague that it doesn't really tell you anything about what the person believes, as the American atheists have admitted. So it's this umbrella term in which these various positions can fall under them, which they're agreeing with. Okay, so his argument is that this definition can be served as an umbrella term for a wide variety of positions that have been identified with atheism. Scholars can then use adjectives like strong and weak to develop a taxonomy that differentiates various specific atheisms. Unfortunately, here's the key point now. This argument overlooks the fact that if atheism is defined as a psychological state, then no proposition can count as a form of atheism, because a proposition is not a psychological state. This undermines his argument in defense of Flew's definition, for it implies that what he calls strong atheism, the proposition or belief in the sense of something being believed, that there is no God, is not really a variety of atheism at all. In short, his proposed umbrella term leaves strong atheism out in the rain. So The key point here is that if you're defining atheism as a psychological state and not in terms of its propositional content, whether there is a God or there isn't, then the strong atheism, which formed one of the connections in the chart that I have on my board there, atheism proper, that there is no God, couldn't rightly fall under the umbrella term atheism, because that is a proposition that there is no God, and atheism that they're proposing, the definition that they're proposing, is not propositional content. It is only the psychological state of the individual. So it doesn't serve any purpose in answering the God question of whether there is or isn't a God. So in reality, this definition that they're proposing is too vague, it's not helpful, and winds up collapsing on itself due to the problem that I just spelled out. Now, why is this definition of atheism important? Why have I just spent 10 or 11 minutes now going over the definition of atheism? The reason that it's important, you have to understand why it has been altered. Now, in 1972, this definition was proposed by Antony Flew and has now become popularized amongst internet atheists. Now, the first reason why it's important to understand this definitional issue is because when having a discussion with a so-called atheist about whether or not God exists, both parties have to be clear on the definition. If they're calling themselves an atheist, I have to understand what they mean by that statement, that I am an atheist. Now, because of this new definition of it being so vague, I have no idea which of the three categories they fall under. And there's more, but I've simplified it to 3 just for the sake of this discussion. Now, I have to understand which position they fall under, because I don't want to attack the so-called strong atheist position when they claim that they're an atheist, if they really fall in something more of the agnostic category. So the point is that when speaking to these so-called atheist individuals, further questions need to be asked in light of this definition problem. Now, the reason why atheism has been redefined is because there's an issue of burden of proof. Now, what is burden of proof in this discussion? Well, the atheists have attempted to redefine the term atheism as a psychological state rather than a proposition, because over time they realized that atheism as a proposition cannot be defended, namely the position that there is no God. Now, why is that? That's because it is a proposition that is a knowledge claim. Now, once you make that knowledge claim that there is no God in a debate, you now share a burden of proof along with the theist in trying to support your claim with evidence. Now, atheists have recognized that this proposition that there is no God, cannot be defended. This is why they have redefined the term. Now, what else can we say about this issue? The reason why they believe that this claim cannot be defended in light of the burden of proof that they now share for making this claim that there is no God is they think that a universal negative, which would be there is no God, cannot be defended. You cannot prove a universal negative. This is a claim that you'll commonly hear. Now, I want to investigate if that claim that we cannot prove that there is a universal negative is true. Is it true that you cannot prove a universal negative, and therefore atheism would be an unproven or unprovable, at least in principle, position? Well, of course, that is not true. You can prove universal negatives. For example, take the statement that there is no such thing as a married bachelor. That's a claim about a universal negative statement. It's a universal negation, okay? Now, this statement is obviously true because in the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man. So by definition, a bachelor cannot be married. So there are no married bachelors, okay? So just by definitional terms, I have proven a universal negative. Second thing, there are no square circles. There is no such thing as a square circle because what defines a square cannot be included in what defines a circle and vice versa. So there is no such thing as a square circle. I have just proved in the past 2 minutes 2 things that are universal negatives, which I have supplied evidence to show that there is no such thing as a married bachelor and there is no such thing as a square circle. So the reason why the atheists have now retracted their original definition of the term atheism is because they think the position there is no God, strong atheism, cannot be defended because now they cannot simply just attack the theistic position. They have to put forth evidence to support their claim that there is no God. Okay, and the reason why they think it can't be defended because they think that the claim that there is no God is a universal negation claim, and they think that those cannot be proven. Meanwhile, I have just given 2 examples that they can be proven. So it's just a cop-out in a way for them to get out of this issue. Now, have atheists in the past defended this old definition? Yes. And what sort of evidence have they attempted to give for the claim that there is no God? Well, in the same way that I showed that there's no such thing as a married bachelor, because that would be a contradiction in terms, atheists have typically tried to show that there is no God by showing that some of God's attributes amongst in connection with the reality that we experience would be contradictory in the same sense that there would not be any such thing as a married bachelor. Now, one of these such arguments and examples is what is known as the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. And typically, in its most simplest form, they claim that evil or suffering is logically inconsistent or incompatible with the existing of an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God. So they attempt to show, at least they attempt to defend this form of atheism by showing that God being all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful is logically inconsistent with the experience that we have of evil and suffering in the world, in the same exact sense that a bachelor cannot be married, you see? So they have attempted to at least defend it that way. And this is the reason why I'm bringing this up, is to show what atheism in terms of the old way it was understood versus the new way, and what this burden of proof issue really is. Okay? So now moving on to the fourth category, I'm going to be discussing the typical atheist epistemology, which, as I said, is the theory of knowledge, how we come to know things, and what knowledge actually is. Okay? Now, on the internet and dealing with these atheists in public sometimes, you'll typically hear them champion science and say things such as, we should only believe what is scientifically proven, or science is the only legitimate form of inquiry, somewhere along those lines. And this points to their empiricism and their stance on knowledge, how we come to know things. Now, let's take that statement and see if it has any merit. We should only believe what is scientifically proven or provable, at least in principle. Or we should only believe what can be empirically verified. That means verified by the five senses. Now, this statement, these two statements are self-contradictory. Why? Take the statement, we should only believe what is scientifically proven. Can that statement itself be scientifically proven? Well, no, of course not, because it is a philosophical or metaphysical claim, okay? It is not a scientific claim that can be proven by science. So it is a statement of first philosophy, what they call first philosophy or first principles. And this axiom or first philosophical claim cannot itself be defended or proved by science. Therefore, its axiom that it uses to get science off the ground cannot be proven by science, so it is contradictory claim. You're claiming that we should only believe what is scientifically proven, but that very statement itself does not meet your own criteria. So it's like shooting yourself in the foot in a sense. Second thing why this claim is not true and should not be held is because science uses things like mathematical principles and logic, rules of logic and reason, in which these two things are not science itself, but science uses them and brings them to the table in order to do science. You couldn't do things like physics without mathematics or logic, okay? Because in doing their scientific inquiries and experiments, they need to be applying the rules of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction. They cannot contradict themselves in their own study or research, otherwise people would laugh them off the stage, so to speak. So these logical and mathematical principles are separate and distinct from science, and science uses them in order to do science. Therefore, science itself cannot account for them, and by using them, it legitimizes them, and in doing so, contradicts itself that science is the only legitimate form of inquiry or knowledge. So this is the distinction between what Kant called a priori knowledge, things like logic and mathematics, versus a posteriori knowledge or inquiry, which has to do with the experience. So one is prior to experience, one is post-experience. Things like logic and mathematics are prior to experience, not post-experience. And this is why the empiricist claim that atheists usually champion about science is completely invalid and false. Now, let's deal with the claim that atheists typically make, that there is no evidence that God exists. That's why they're not theists. Now, I'm going to go over what's known as the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which in recent years has been championed by a Christian theologian and philosopher, William Lane Craig. But its origins trace far back, and in fact, the kalam is the Arabic word for word, you see, in which Imam Ghazali championed this argument way back hundreds of years ago, and Craig recognizes this. This is why he gives credit to the Muslim theologians that champion this by calling it the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And it goes something like this. P1, premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, this is just an introduction to the topic of atheism and this argument itself. I am not attempting to give a full-orbed explanation of the argument, all the evidence for each premise and what the conclusion actually entails, along with dealing with any possible objection that may go against this. I will deal with that in another separate video in which I'll have more time to go over it thoroughly. However, let's take the principle or the premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Is this true? Yes, it has constantly verified and has never been falsified. Now, atheists typically try to give an example from quantum physics, in which they claim that quantum physics gives an example of the contrary, that some things can come into existence without a cause. However, this is a fallacious claim. Why? Because the quantum vacuum is not nothing. The first principle is saying that out of nothing, nothing comes. That means something with a beginning doesn't come from nothing. Okay? But the quantum vacuum is not nothing. It is a physical system. It is a sea of fluctuating energy that has a physical status and is governed by physical laws. Now, what does the Quran say about this principle and the universe coming into existence? Well, let's take a look at Quran chapter 52, verse 35 and 36. It says, "Or were they created without a creative agencies? Or are they the creators? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? Nay, they are sure of nothing." So Allah is pointing to this principle. Where did you come from? Were you created from nothing without a creative agency? That's one option. Or are they the creators? Did you create yourself? Did you create yourself? Okay. Were you created from nothing? Or did they create the heavens and the earth? Are they gods in that sense that they are the creators of everything? And Allah says, nay, they are sure of nothing. Why? Because He is the creator of the heavens and earth. He is the creator of all things. Now, going on to the second premise, the universe began to exist. Well, the universe is eternal. Why? Because, and as mathematicians have actually studied and shown with examples like Hilbert's Hotel, that when you postulate an actually infinite number of things, in which if the universe was eternal, an actually infinite number of events would have had to occur by now at this point, well, the actual infinite is just a figment of the imagination. It doesn't actually exist in reality. Actually, infinity and infinite number of things cannot possibly exist. Now, Imam Ghazali gave an example of this in his works, in which he asked you to imagine, okay, two planetary objects. Let's take the Earth and Mars, orbiting the sun, and they're both orbiting the sun from eternity. But the sun is orbiting the Earth, okay, once every year. And say, for example, Mars is orbiting the sun once every 6 months. So it would orbit the sun twice in 1 year, where the Earth would only orbit it once in a year. Now, if the universe were actually infinite, then how many times would Mars have orbited the sun? Well, you'd have to say an infinite number of times. But how many times did the Earth orbit the sun? Well, you'd also have to say an infinite number of times. The problem with this is, intuitively, you would think that Mars has orbited the sun double the amount of times that the Earth has. But that is obviously not the case, because we are told that the universe is eternal, so both would be infinite. You can't have one infinite number of things be larger than another. This is the problem of the absurdity of infinites, different categories of infinites being larger than the other. So this is attempted to show that infinity cannot actually exist, you see? And I know this may be a little bit confusing, but you can YouTube, type in the search, Hilbert's Hotel, in which is another example to show the absurdity of the actual infinite. Okay, now, all scientific evidence also points to this principle that the universe began to exist. For example, the Big Bang, the expanding universe, the cosmic microwave background that we see, the second law of thermodynamics, the BGV theorem. All matter, space-time, and energy came into existence almost 14 billion years ago when the universe began to exist. Now, The Quran confirms this in chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "Praise be to Allah, who created the heavens and the earth and made darkness and light, yet those who disbelieve set up equals to their Lord." So Allah is saying that the universe is not eternal. He created it. He created everything. Now, that brings us to the great conclusion that therefore the universe has a cause. Now, some people are wondering in the audience, so what? What's your point, Jake? Well, the point is that this cause must be immaterial, spaceless, timeless, changeless, immensely powerful, incredibly intelligent, and also personal. Now, people are asking, Jake, how do you get that from the cause, there being a cause of the universe? This is because the cause brought all of these things into being. Namely, time, space, matter, and energy all began to exist about 13.7 billion years ago. Now, if this is true, then the cause of those things must not have those things in his being. He must not possess and be in time or in space or of matter, material substance. Because if he did, then we couldn't make the claim that time, matter, space, and energy, all of those things came into being. Because if the creator of those things also possessed them, but then he wouldn't be the creator of them. You see? So, this creator, this cause of the universe must have the attributes that I just described. Now, I don't, as I said, have time to go over all the possible objections of this argument and defend them. I went over a couple of them throughout the presentation, but inshallah, I will go more in depth into this argument and defending it against possible objections. Now, what does the Quran say about atheists? Do they have a right standing with God? Some people, some liberals might say, well, atheists aren't really doing anything wrong. If they're good people, they can go to heaven and all these kind of things. Let's investigate this claim. What does the Quran say about the typical atheists? Okay? Now that's in chapter 45, verse 23 to 27. It says, "Seest thou," this is Allah saying something that you see now, "Seest thou him who takes his desire for his God, his own God besides Allah, and Allah leaves him in error knowingly and seals his hearing and his heart and puts a covering on his sight. Who can then guide him after Allah? Will you not then mind? And they say," speaking of those people now who Allah just mentioned, take for their own desire, their own judgment as a God besides Allah. Why? Because they make this statement that follows. "And they say, there is naught but our life of the world. We die and we live, and nothing destroys us but time." And Allah says what? "And they have no knowledge of that. They only conjecture." So, who makes that claim that we live and we die and nothing destroys us but time and there's no afterlife, so to speak? The atheist makes that claim, and Allah says about that person, he has no knowledge of this, he only follows conjecture, and by doing so, he takes his own desire for a God besides Allah. Now, what is that? That is shirk. So in doing so, they become of the mushrikeen. Okay, they're mushriks. Now, Allah then says in verse 25, "And when our clear messages are recited to them, their only argument is that they say, 'Bring back our fathers if you are truthful.' Say, Allah gives you life, then makes you die. Then he will gather you to the day of resurrection, wherein is no doubt. You must be yaqeen of that, certain. But most people know not." You see? "And Allah's is the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. And on the day when the hour comes to pass, on that day will the followers of falsehood perish." So atheists are the followers of falsehood. They only conjecture without guidance from Allah. And in doing so, they become mushrikeen. They commit shirk. So, lastly, I want to leave you with this verse of the uniqueness of Allah and why the attributes mentioned about the cause apply to Allah, which simply means the God. So the cause of the universe is rightly understood with these attributes to be God Himself. Allah says in Surah 112, verses 1 to 4, Al-Ikhlas, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul Wallahu Ahad, Allahu Samad, Lam Yalid wa Lam Yulad, wa Lam Yakun Lahu Kufuwan Ahad. Okay, so I'm leaving you with this quote to show that Allah created the heavens and the earth and everything that exists, and it is our duty to submit to Him and to Him alone. Salam alaikum. See you next week. Inshallah.